Hi, everyone. It's Don Davis here, one of the co-hosts of your favorite podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. And for this episode, it's our year in review. So it's our last episode of 2021. It's been an incredible ride this year, and we've had a lot of fun making this show. But in this show, we're going to unpack what happened in 2021. And what we do is we go back and we look at some of those things we said way back in March and April, and how do we do? And some things Brian and I got right, some things we got wrong. Spoiler alert, we got more right than wrong, so that was pretty cool. But it was a lot of fun to do that. And then if you follow us on LinkedIn, we've been doing a lot of polls, and we started to talk about some of those results, some of the things we observed from those polls, gave some thoughts and insights there. And then at the end, we start to talk about predictions and what do we see in 2022? What do we expect for the year? And gave you some thoughts there. So it's a little bit of a longer show, but we had a lot to unpack from the past year. It's been a lot of fun. So we appreciate you guys listening. Don't forget, hit that like button. And thanks a lot. And I hope everyone has a great holiday season. So we'll talk to you again soon and enjoy the show.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Bryan Most and Don Davis.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Bryan Most, SVP of Retail Strategy at NYSHEX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. Well, Don, here we are. It's mid-December, and we're just a few weeks away from Christmas. So how are you doing? Have you started your Christmas shopping yet?
Well, I think I revealed on an earlier pod that I might be a late shopper, which is a bad year for that, apparently, because inventories are low. But that's not entirely true. I did buy a couple of small things, but some of that major stuff, I have an idea what I'm going to do, but I haven't gotten it yet.
All right. Well, look, I mean, you're an insider in the supply chain. You know that you have to shop early if you want to get the good stuff. So get on it. All right.
But what about you? Are you all done? I mean, are you got everything or what?
Here's the great thing. My wife is amazing. She's done a lot of e-commerce shopping, and so there have been many packages showing up at the front porch. So I feel like we're on a good track, but I don't know for sure. But based on the quantity of boxes, I think we're okay.
That's great. That's good stuff.
But it is funny. It's hard to believe, right? I mean, we're about to close out 2021, and we've got another new year just around the corner. And 2021 was quite a year for most of us in the supply chain. I mean, it's always kind of fun to look back at the previous year and start thinking about what's coming next. Although with all the disruption this past year, I'm not sure how many people actually want to take a look back, but I think it's important to look back with a critical eye and see what we could actually learn from the previous year and how it might apply to the future. And the other thing that's a bit hard for me to believe is we've recorded about 30 podcasts over this past year. And, you and I thought it might be fun for the viewers to look back at some of those early podcasts way back about this time last year and some of the things that we thought might happen or predicted might happen. Maybe we should go back and see how good we are at predicting these days.
Yeah. I think it was fun to kind of look back. It's incredible to think of where we started with our podcast, and we've been hanging around for a while and got a lot of great feedback. Got some more feedback this week that people are like, hey, we like your show. So really appreciate that from the listeners, and keep it coming. We keep changing up things and trying to do things a bit different based on your feedback. So that's been terrific. And I'm going to dive right into it, Brian, if you don't mind.
That's good.
I started to go back and look at some of the things we talked about. And if I go back to, let's say, March of this year, there was still a lot of uncertainty. As I recall, it was like no one really knew if things were going to change or drop off at that particular time. And some of the things that we talked about is, we didn't expect at that point that we didn't think there'd be a return to normal, and that we were facing a new normal, whatever that looks like. But the whole idea around, rates going down again, that it was going to be ample supply, we just weren't seeing that. And there were a few different reasons for that. I think that we had heard that there was still a backlog in Asia, that demand was still high. Now, again, I don't think we knew the extent that we'd see things and that there'd be this strength of the market. And also you'd have these disruptions taking out capacity, but there was a sense that things would remain strong throughout the year.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things. It's hard being in the prediction business at all these days, right? In terms of how unpredictable things are. But it's kind of funny to look back and say, well, of course, things were going to continue the way they were. But last spring there were still quite a few people I know on the shipper side holding out, saying, "Hey, look, I'm not sure that this market is going to stay this strong. Yes, I know spot market rates are going up, demands still look strong, but I'm not sure that it'll continue, and I'm going to kind of wait this thing out and see what happens." And I think for those that waited and kind of ran up against a May 1 deadline, I'm not sure that would have been a great strategy. But without a doubt, I think things stayed just unbelievably strong. And the one thing that I think for me that became, way more of an issue than I could have ever believed is just the amount of congestion that happened at ports around the world. And of course, Southern California is kind of in the spotlight, but we know there's congestion at ports around the world on all coasts. But just the amount of impact that had on active capacity over time. I mean, at some points, I think it was calculated at 10 or 12% of active capacity was idled due to that. And that's certainly something I didn't see coming, but we're still experiencing that today.
Yeah, I think if I think back when we started talking about this, that one thing happened immediately after that, and that was that Ever Given had got stuck. And that created a lot of headlines. And I think that was like the first time that you saw our industry really start to become in the spotlight. I think today it's definitely a lot more in the spotlight, but that was the first thing. But I mean, it was just, I don't know how anyone could have predict the level of blank sailings that you've seen. I don't think anyone could predict COVID outbreaks in ports. And these are things that are just adding to this problem, right? You have this capacity, as you talk about, that's being removed every week. And it's not voluntary. I mean, trust me, for the carriers, they don't want to blank because that's revenue that's gone. They can't make that up. So it's not easy for them either, but they don't really have a choice. If they're going to operate a service and a network, they have to blank. And it's just something they have to deal with. And again, if they could fix it on their own, I think they would. But certainly from a business standpoint, I don't see carriers wanting to blank at all. It's just a matter of these other types of disruptions are just consuming capacity, and it's just making it tougher to get caught up and get back to, I don't know that it's going to be, I don't know what the new normal exactly looks like, but I don't think you're going to see where there's all this excess supply anytime in the near future.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the other things that comes to mind for me is even back at TPM of last year, it seems like forever ago now that we're planning for the next one. But, I actually sat on a panel and, the topic was around being a customer of choice. And, not a term I'm sure everybody, knew about or knew what it actually meant to be a customer of choice, but it certainly became a theme throughout the year. And I tell you what, it seems to me that carriers were and continue to be very, very selective in terms of who they're committing capacity to, why they're committing capacity to them. And I think that's certainly one of the things that certainly came to the forefront. If you're not a customer who's willing to engage in these discussions on a longer term basis, if you're not a customer who's willing to be flexible, if you don't have any handle on your forecast or planning process, I think that you saw carriers be very, very conservative in terms of engaging those types of customers. And I'm just curious, I mean, from a carrier perspective, did you also see that one kind of come to fruition?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think I love that you brought up that point because early on you were talking about that, like different types of strategies and becoming a customer of choice. And I think that's still really important. And I think, look, if you don't feel like you're a customer of choice and you're a shipper out there today, I don't think it's too late. I think there's things you could do to try and improve your position. But for those that were doing things and those kind of things that we're talking about is, communicating with your carriers to be upfront with what your expectations are. Don't have your value proposition be price. And, now that seems sort of silly, right? Because the prices have increased so much and that, the rates have changed significantly. And the other fact is there's nowhere to go. If I say, okay, I'm going to pull my business from a carrier, well, where am I going to go? To the spot market? That doesn't seem very friendly. So, I mean, of course, in today's environment, it's a bit different, but I still think there's things you can do. And I think when you start, one of the things we had talked about when we were talking about customer choice was thinking more long term. And that is 100% something that's happened today. You can see carriers thinking more long term. We can see shippers thinking more long term. And I think that's been a change because I think the amount of long term contracts that you hear talked about today is much higher. And even when I was at a carrier, I mean, you might have a handful of long term deals, but not really that many. Now, again, at that time, the rates were a lot different. And you're just treading along somewhere slightly above cost and not really making a profit on these, where today it's totally different, which is why I think you see that willingness. But back to your point about being customer of choice, I think it's tremendously relevant for carriers, and carriers are now really pointing to those customers and saying like, hey, how do we partner for a longer term, given that level of relationship?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Don, one of the other big topics is just the amount of profit, right, that the carriers were raking in, over time. And I think you were certainly one that, had said, hey, look, as long as, space is tight and, the market is strong, that will continue. I mean, could you ever have foreseen that they will have made the profits that are expected for the year? And in terms of how some of them early on have decided to invest some of the profits?
Well, first of all, make no mistake. I never would have guessed carriers would have the kind of profits they have today. And I'm very happy for them, by the way, because I went through that periods of time where it was very difficult. Carriers were insolvent, and it was just very difficult to operate. And it was very cost-driven business, and it was a tough time. Now, I understand there's another side, and all the shippers are probably saying bad things about me right now. But the point is, I understand there's a cost, and maybe things got a little too extreme, and I think in some sense they did. But a healthy ocean carrier is good for the industry. And I said that from the beginning. I said the silver lining is that carriers making money is good because now they can really start to invest. They can invest in technology. They can invest in their services. They can do things that are different. Now, we've seen some of that investment be spent on some things like NVOs. That has started to happen, or the forwarding space, if you will. We've also seen the carriers operate where they're taking different terminal interests, terminal stakes. So you're starting to see the investment in the operations and the business, which is good. But I think there's also a technology play. But I think all these things will help the industry long term. Maybe now when you're just in a difficult environment, you have all this backlog, you have all this demand, you have capacity being consumed, as we already talked about. That's not really great. But in 5 years, our things are going to look a lot better, and our shippers going to have different levels of services that they can choose and decide this price point works for them. That's where I think we're headed. But to say that, carrier profits are good, I think they are in some cases rates too extreme. I think, $30,000 sounds like a lot of money to me. So I think once you normalize those things, it's going to be much better. And I think shippers will have more choices once things settle down.
Yeah, I would tell you as well. I wouldn't have ever predicted early on that we were going to see spot market rates approach $25,000 and $30,000. I think back at that time we were getting into the 10,000 range, and I never would have expected that it pushed as high as it did for the period of time that it did. But it's funny, you talk earlier about, some of the shippers, getting mad at you for talking about profits. I'm not sure that it's ever been an issue of we don't want carriers to make money. I think from a shipper perspective, it's just we actually want to, get what we're paying for. And this idea of one of the things I think surprised me is just, how the level of reliability really just kind of continued to diminish throughout the year. And again, not blaming the carriers per se. A lot of these things are out of their control, to your point, with ports closing due to COVID and massive congestion and all those things. But to say that you've got global reliability numbers, around 30%, and to some places like the West Coast, it's in the high teens. I wouldn't have ever predicted that. But at the same time, I'm not sure it gets, much better quickly, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think to your point, I think that, carriers offered the rates to the shippers, and the fact that they weren't making a lot of money, I mean, that was a voluntary decision. They don't have to match rates. They can let the business go somewhere else. So, I mean, to some extent, you could say it was a self-inflicted wound because the pricing came from somewhere and a decision had to be made. It just was low margin. And I think it's now that you see higher margin rates, it's much better for the carriers. And I think it'll be much better for the industry. Again, in the short term, the optics are terrible. Service levels are low. On-time performance is low. Rates have never been higher. But that is not something the carriers want to do. They're not trying to create that. In fact, I feel like many of them are trying to fix it. But it's just the environment we're in. There's different dynamics that are pushing things in that direction. But from an optics point of view, I mean, it's not pretty.
Yeah, no, I'd love to get your perspective too. One of the things that emerged early, and I think, to be honest, we both thought that this would continue to emerge as an offering by carriers were kind of these priority products. The idea that a shipper could pay, $1,000 to $3,000 for a premium product and get guaranteed equipment and space. And it seemed like that was going to be the way to go, but I don't know if things just all kind of merged together or ultimately carriers couldn't, deliver on those. But what's your perspective? I think we thought it was going to happen, but I'm not sure it really either took off the way it was supposed to, or just, I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Well, I think there was a plan to have like some level of priority service. And I think around about the same time that things were starting changing earlier in the year, a lot of carriers had different types of priority services. I think the problem became that the spot rate got really high. You're talking 5 digits. And if you have an add-on, let's say $2,000, and you're going to add that on to my long-term contract rate to prioritize me. Well, that long-term contract rate plus your priority product is nowhere near that spot rate, just not even close. So it becomes quite a conundrum for a carrier to say, well, where do I want to allocate my space? Do I want to allocate it to the short-term spot? Or do I want to have a premium product where I might be shortchanging myself? Well, I think different carriers had different strategies, but those things that we had expected, which was kind of an add-on to protect yourself or to get some level of priority, really kind of slowed down, almost disappeared in some cases, but it really shifted to FAK, and the FAK type of rate became the priority service, in my view.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I know that over time, I think carriers, their ability to differentiate services and for customers who are willing to pay a premium price to get a differentiated service, I think is important in the future to try and get figured out, because I think it'd be a valuable offering over time once networks get settled and things of that nature. Because I think the other thing that we certainly saw was, shippers kind of taking matters into their own hands. This idea of accepting early on that we've got to do something different. The same old way of doing things is not going to work in this market. And the ones that had size and scale, it very quickly hit the headlines that they're chartering their own ships and using extra loaders and everything you can think of to help facilitate the movement of their goods. And then maybe small and medium-sized guys who can't go out and charter ships started using technology and process and customer of choice strategies to try and get priority and move cargo. And I really, didn't think that it would go as fast as it did, to be quite honest with you. But I think shippers felt like they had no choice. And I think they were being pushed by their C-suite to be creative and innovative and to do something fast. And it moved pretty quick. And the cool thing about it, though, is it's just kind of an evolution over time, right? I mean, it used to be, you booked a certain number of containers on a particular vessel voyage, and that happened. And then, you kind of evolved to these extra loaders where shippers started to now get the idea and the process down of, okay, instead of shipping, 10 or 20 containers on a vessel, how do I organize myself to ship 200 or 300 containers on a vessel? What are all the things that I need to do at origin with my manufacturers, and consolidating orders and, pushing everything through one sailing. And then, once it lands, how do I efficiently, get those containers out of the port and what have you? And then the next natural evolution is I can actually take a whole ship, now that I've figured out how to do extra loaders. So, I underestimated kind of the evolution and how fast it was going to move, but it came pretty quick.
Yeah, I think to go back to that other point, I mean, on the priority services, I think I remember I thought it would be something that was available, and I was 100% wrong. It changed just for reasons we already talked about. But one of the things I think we got right is that, people need to think differently and not try and do things the same way. And to your point about chartering ships, I mean, I think that was something that was totally new, pretty innovative, became a reliable solution for some companies. And I think that whole idea of thinking differently, I think that continues, frankly, is that don't try and do things the same way. I wouldn't try to say, well, I'm just going to send my tender out in March and see what the carriers say. I think that is probably not an effective strategy. I think you have to think differently. But again, going back to something you talked about before, if you're a shipper of choice and you have that type of relationship with your carrier, you should really be talking to them about what options exist today. What can I do in the short term, medium term, long term? And I think those kinds of conversations are important. But if anybody's thinking about doing it the same way, please don't. I don't think that's going to be an effective solution, and you might be disappointed with the results.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense. I think back to this idea of there used to always be a bit of give and take left, or we kind of call this buffer, a grace of 10 or 20%. We have an agreed allocation, and it can kind of plus or minus 10 or 20% and be able to operate kind of under that premise. And I think if a shipper showed up with less than 10 or 20%, I think the carrier was probably okay with it. But us thinking that 20% flex, whether it was pre-negotiated or not, was going to be there, probably didn't turn out to be the case. I think with just how oversubscribed services were and the lack of flexibility that carriers had, I just didn't hear much flexibility from shippers. It seemed like you got what was committed in your MQC, and it was really hard to get anything above and beyond that. And I think that's what started pushing shippers into that spot market, which obviously drove that rate up pretty fast.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, if I look at how things have evolved, there might have been a plan. On paper, there might be 20% of your capacity not covered under MQC. The problem is, as we talked about earlier, a lot of that capacity is being consumed by blank sailings and omissions and delays. So with that capacity being consumed, it makes it more difficult to honor those existing MQCs you have. So in that environment, you might have had a great plan and said, hey, I got this capacity available. It just wasn't there. It's just getting eaten by these blanks. And now you want to service your customer. And I think carriers in general really want to service their customers. The problem is, in this environment where you have less capacity than you might have contracted for, it's not that you did that deliberately. It's just that your capacity keeps getting consumed by these blanks. And now you have to make some tough decisions. So my sense is carriers are starting to understand that and to plan differently for the next contracting cycle. But, just with that capacity disappearing, it makes it really tough to manage and have extra space available.
Yeah, no question. I think without a doubt, shippers needed options, and if they didn't have them, it was going to be pretty tough outside of their core base of carriers or existing relationships with NVOs in the spot market. I think it became extremely difficult, and that's probably something that carries forward. I'm sure those folks that are in the tender process right now, or considering it very soon, or even that have already gone through it. We know some people have already gone, really early this year. I'm sure options and diversification was probably going to be part of that future strategy.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think diversification makes sense. I think giving yourself options makes sense. And I think that point about, tendering, I my understanding is that several companies have already started. Some, as you say, are already done. And, I think there's some that are done but still looking. I think that maybe they didn't get everything they want covered in their contract. So now they're looking at different alternatives. I know that there's different types of commodity segments and verticals that are still out there looking. And again, the good news is it's still early. I don't think all the capacity is committed, but some of those plans are really starting to take shape as we head towards the end of the year.
Yeah, no question. This other theme that you kind of hear from a shipper perspective is they've worked so hard over the years to kind of lean out their supply chain and manage transit times and minimize in transit inventory and carrying costs. And I think we just again kind of saw that go out the window. Very quickly shippers had to start to add weeks of inventory and add weeks back into their transits, and sometimes even months, right? You initially heard, well, I'm going to add 2 to 4 weeks back in, and then you heard 4 to 6, and I even heard in some cases 8 weeks of additional inventory to accommodate for delays and disruption. And so this idea of just-in-time inventory, I think we said was probably not going to be realistic, and obviously to a degree that was true. It was more about, again, resiliency, redundancy and options. But again, it's one of those things where I never would have thought that within a 12-month period we would have been adding 8 weeks, almost 2 months of inventory back into the supply chain. But when you look at some of the ports of entry and some of the wait times and some of the anchored ships, you understand why they're doing it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to think about that. Towards the end of March, we were talking about, like, don't plan on just-in-time inventory, and that seem to be right. I think, to be fair, though, I don't know that anybody knew at that time the type of environment we'd be heading into, and that you'd see the number of ships parked outside of LA, the number of emissions we've seen, port congestion spread across a variety of ports. I think that made it difficult. So I think it was interesting to say, hey, that's something I think we got dead right. But to be fair, the degree that it happened, I think, is much greater than anyone else had expected.
Yeah, no question. And unfortunately, right, those are the added costs that I think allowed shippers this year to just expand their view of kind of their cost or their management of the supply chain. One of the things we talked about is for so many years, it was a procurement exercise on how can I, maximize the lowest possible rate across my carriers, and how can I get the most capacity at those rates, and then just obviously execute against it. And the reality of it is those rates that might have been the lowest rates certainly didn't get you priority on ships. And then you start to see, well, I saved a couple $100 on the ocean freight rate, but it cost me a couple thousand on the land side or on the warehousing side or in lost sales. And so I think that was one of the aha moments for a lot of shippers to say, this is way more than just an ocean freight rate that I need to be considering. It's really this end-to-end cost equation and a degree of reliability across all of those handoffs that's really going to make the difference.
Yeah, and I can remember early on, in one of our, I think it was early April, we talked about different types of contracting strategies, and you were talking about, using a diversification approach and thinking about how can I contract differently and how can I use that within my book of business to just take different positions and protect myself. And that's something I thought was a pretty cool statement by you, because I think those that we saw take that approach, particularly with like a two-way committed type of contract, they saw quite a bit of benefit there. And we heard feedback from shippers during the course of this year who said, wow, I'm really happy I did this. There were some that even said, wow, I wish I did more of this. I didn't know how great it would be leading into it. But I think it gives you some thought around, okay, now that I learned from that in the past year, what am I going to do this year? How can I diversify further? What other kinds of things can I do? And I think that's something that should be top of mind for most shippers is how can I diversify? How can I do things differently? And I think that's something carriers can be open to, but I think it's about having that communication and being open about what you're willing to do, and then working it through your carriers on, this is what I can do for 2022.
No, it makes total sense. I mean, going through something like this obviously accelerates certain innovations, makes other, existing practices obsolete, and you learn and iterate your way through it. But I think a lot of shippers were surprised. Again, this was about the time of TPM. This information starts coming out where you start to hear major carrier executives starting to share their thoughts around committed agreements, mutually committed agreements. You had, Maersk, Hapag, O&E, you had a lot of the major carriers saying, over the next 5 years, we would expect that the majority of the contracts we have with our strategic beneficial cargo owners will be these committed types of agreements. And there were probably a lot of people that hadn't even heard what a two-way committed agreement was or knew what was entailed. But I would tell you that, there were a lot of people that took notice that those carriers were saying that and then reflecting to say, I better learn about this. I better educate myself. I better figure out a way to test or pilot the concept to see how it could work for me, how it could and help me mitigate risk and bring some of that resilience into my supply chain. And yeah, I think a lot of those customers benefited from the strategy and the experience. But where they're really going to see the competitive advantages is that they're a year ahead now of those that didn't try it. Right? Because ultimately, if we think this is where the industry is going, you're better off to have tried and learned so you can figure out how you want to expand that or do it differently in the next year or in a longer term agreement. So a lot of learnings, but without a doubt, I think that between shippers and carriers, that's the direction this thing's going.
Yeah. And I think that's such an interesting point, because one of the things we talked about early on was that there's two things that are top of mind for carriers. They want to make sure their ships are full, and they want to make sure that their rates are profitable. And, the two-way committed contract enables them to do that. But to your point about thinking more longer term, now you see that has really started to take fold on a longer term basis. So not only do you have a two-way committed contract, but now you see that for a much longer duration in some ways. And that to me has been an interesting evolution. But to that point, that really checks two boxes, right? A diversification strategy where you have a two-way committed contract, and now you're starting to think more long term than you did before. And that's really been that evolution that has happened over the past year, which brings us where we are today, which again, there's a few different things out there, which a year ago, we weren't even talking about these kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it starts to make you think about what's coming next, right? And how do you apply these learnings? What continues to accelerate, what maybe becomes obsolete. And obviously it's hard being in the prediction business these days, but one of the things that's pretty cool that I've seen is some of these online polls that you can do through social media, in particular LinkedIn. We here at NYSHEX have asked for insights from our members and from just the general shipping public, and some of the responses have been pretty telling about where people's minds are and what they're thinking going forward. And in particular to this discussion we were just having about multi-year agreements, I know they've been talked about for a number of years. I know people understand the concept, but maybe haven't necessarily felt the need or the desire to pull the trigger on it. But one of the questions we asked is have you considered signing ocean contracts longer than 12 months? And it was an overwhelming yes. So 71% of the respondents said yes. I'm actually considering signing a contract longer than 12 months going into this next year. I think that tells you that people are ready to move to something that's way more predictable, more reliable than what they've had in the past.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you've talked about on a number of shows, Brian, is that you don't have to do this for 100% of your business. No one's saying that if you move 50,000 TEUs that you're going to tie up 50,000 TEUs in a multi-year contract. I mean, maybe you would, but I think you take a lane and you say, okay, this is a portion of my business I want to commit longer term, but to protect myself and have a more stable supply chain running, I think that makes a lot of sense. And what we've seen too at NYSHEX is that there's a tremendous demand for multi-year. There's a willingness to do it. And I think that could be a win-win. And going back to something we've already talked about a bit earlier, that shipper of choice, how do I become a shipper of choice if in an environment where I may not feel like that? Well, this is one way to do it, because the more you can commit and the longer term relationship you can build with a carrier, that underlines the fact that I'm not being transactional. I'm not going anywhere. I want to partner with you. And if we have a 3-year contract, we can start to think about other solutions versus just worrying about the price all the time. I'm committed to you. Let's talk about the operations and execution and how we can do a better job on that, and not talk about, $100 here or $500 there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. This reminder again of, when you are de-risking or you're creating kind of this portfolio approach to your business, I don't think anybody would ever recommend you do 100% of anything, any one particular thing. And so the idea of saying, yeah, I mean, you identify the portion of your business you want to de-risk, and then you start to work on that. And yes, while there are unknowns out there, there's less of your total, addressable business that's left uncovered. And I think it makes total sense. But the other idea of kind of moving in these committed agreements is they're supported by technology, right? It's based in data and facts and technology that are helping, both sides achieve what they ultimately, desire, which is again, this efficient, predictable relationship between the two. And again, it's telling when, you think about this. One of the other questions that we asked is, are you and your team implementing new technology in 2022 to help prevent further disruptions? And again, overwhelming 78% of those said yes, we are going to be implementing technology. Now, again, that could be visibility, it could be optimization, but this idea of having contracts that are more data, factual based, I think makes a lot of sense if we truly want to get to these relationships that are mutually beneficial.
Yeah, I think for those that answered negatively, that 20 or 22% that said no, they should probably start looking into it, because I think that this is something that can help. I think for a long time, it didn't feel like there were very good options out there on as far as visibility or performance management. And I think today you have some different options that are out there. I think about some of the things that we're doing here at NYSHEX, which help people. You can see the effectiveness and the benefit of using some technology that's out there. So I think that for those that haven't, they should really look into that and start exploring that avenue, because a lot of companies are doing it. And I think there's just more options out there today than there was, 2, 3 years ago. And even next year, there'll probably even be more. But it's something that companies should really be driving towards, because it can be an effective way to manage your business.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And maybe this is done where, again, it's tough being in the prediction business, but I'll read this final poll, and maybe this will help kind of maybe let you, share where you think this thing is going to go. And of course, I'll try and do the same. But the final question that was asked is, how much longer do you think the current supply chain disruptions will continue? And the options were less than 3 months, less than 6 months, less than 12 months, or more than a year. And 61% of the respondents said this is going to happen. This is going to be the environment for more than a year. So I think that tells you kind of where people's heads are at. They're obviously then saying, I need to use technology. I need to diversify my business because I think this thing's going to continue. I ask you that question. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, again, I've said it before on the show that I'm not a good predictor of things. If you look at my football picks, they're certainly a good indication. I'm not a good predictor of much, but I do tend to think that there's not really a sign that things are going to change. I don't think anything that demand is going to drop off significantly, particularly when you point to this congestion problem, which I don't think is going to go away. I think we've talked about this on a couple of shows. There's some labor uncertainty out there. What's going to happen with the union negotiations next year? I just don't see that this is something that's going to change very quickly from a supply demand perspective. I do think there's some other things I would predict going into next year. I think multi-year contracting is here to stay. I think that's largely driven, again, from the fact that carriers are profitable. And if I make a multi-year contract at, let's say, a $4,000 rate or an $8,000 rate, hey, that's profitable. I'm not taking a huge risk by doing that. If I take a multi-year contract rate at $1,000, $800, I'm probably not making money off that. So I'm probably less willing to do that in that space. So I think it just makes sense that if your rate's profitable, that it's like, hey, look, I might do this for a portion of my business, but I'm going to take a position here. It's still profitable. I'm not going to feel bad about it. But when you take a position at a lower price point, that doesn't make much sense to a carrier. Just a couple other things on predictions. I think for any overflow or excess capacity, it's going to be expensive. I think that the spot rates are still going to be high, probably 5 digits, and that's going to go up and down. But I think that there's just, if you're going to need incremental space, it's going to be pricey. That is just not going to be easy to come by. There is really no indication that access capacity will become available here and there, extra loader, but demand is still going to be strong. And then finally, I think you're going to see more consolidation in the NVO space. I don't think that's quite done yet. I think we've seen some acquisition there. I think you're probably going to see some more consolidation. Who knows who exactly that'll be, but I think there's a number of signs pointing to consolidation, and that may be between NVOs, that may be between carriers, but I'm not saying too much as a secret. HMM just came out and said part of their 2026 strategy is to get into this space. So I think there's enough signs pointing to that next year and continuing for the foreseeable future that there'll continue to be consolidation in the MVO space. But what about you, Brian? What are you predicting for next year?
Hey, those are all good, and I'm with you. I'm always hesitant to go on record with anything like this, but I start with the fundamentals as well, right? All of the indications from demand, especially from retail sector and others, are that demand stays strong. Obviously, there could be another major event that affects that, but at this point, it looks like demand stays strong. Yes, at some point there'll be an intersection with, the services industry, but it doesn't look like it's anytime soon. We've got new variants coming out all the time. And we know that inventories have been depleted. So there's still an inventory rebuild that has to happen over time. So to me, demand seems like it's going to be strong for the next 12 months. We know that there isn't any significant new capacity coming in, probably until the year after. So that indicates a tight market. And as you said, unless congestion quickly resolves itself, which unless the terminals can find velocity that is just not there today, that's going to continue to be a drag on capacity. So I think that points to another challenging market without a doubt. And then you add the complications of potential labor disruptions and other things. And I think that you're going to start to see, again, shippers be more proactive in managing their supply chains. Maybe it's not chartering ships, but I think very soon after Chinese New Year, you could start to see shippers pulling orders forward. Hey, look, if they're worried that there's going to be a labor disruption in the summer, they may start pulling orders forward already and get it in the pipeline to try and get through the West Coast. I think you're going to see capacity extremely tight to the Gulf Coast and to the East Coast. In fact, I'm not even sure how much capacity is going to be available, to be quite honest with you. Even if shippers wanted to diversify and shift or divert cargo, it just might not be there. And so when you talk about spot rates continuing to be high, I would look at the Gulf and the East Coast, which could absolutely just go through the stratosphere. If capacity is that tight and people are trying to avoid the West Coast, you could see persistent high spot rates there. But I agree with you in terms of these longer term relationships. I think they finally take hold. And I think that also starts to move people away from this traditional May 1 cycle. I still think you'll probably have groupings of contract around January 1st and probably around May 1st, but I think it all starts to blend, to be quite honest, over time. And I think you start to see overlapping agreements and, start and expiration dates. So all of this excitement we've had over the last however many years of, what's May 1 going to be? I don't know if you're going to have that anymore. And I don't know necessarily if that's a bad thing, but I just see that it's going to be more of an ongoing, I think, negotiation and procurement cycle throughout the next year or two. And I think the inflationary pressures that are out there probably continue. So, challenges with labor, and do retailers or others pass through costs or not? I think it becomes almost impossible to not. You can only, absorb so much cost pressure before you do pass it through. And then ultimately the consumer has to start to pick up some of that. So I think, unfortunately, we're probably in for another year of challenging market dynamics. But my hope is that, again, from the look back and from the learning and the innovations that we've done, that it does help facilitate the flow for those that have chose to implement it.
Yeah, I do love that idea that maybe May 1 doesn't mean as much as it used to. I mean, it is my birthday, so it's an important date. But from a contract negotiation perspective, I think mix it up, don't make it all the same. I mean, I think the fact that there's only one real trade lane that traditionally negotiates all their contracts at the same time, and that's the TP eastbound trade. No other trade in the world has such a high density of contracts expiring at the same time. And is that really where you want to be? And I would say hey, maybe there's some benefits about, being an outlier and looking at things differently. So I think that's really neat. I just got one more question for you, Brian. I mean, predictions. Is this Ben's last year? Is Ben Roethlisberger done, or is he got some more in the tank? Is he gonna go play for the Dolphins? What is he gonna do?
Well, for those of you out there that don't know, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and the Steelers have been my team for a long time, and we had a lot of good years and a lot of Super Bowl wins. But we're at the point where I think so, Don. If I was going to make a prediction, I think this is Ben Roethlisberger's last year. I think he will be a first ballot Hall of Famer. He's top 10 in all categories as a quarterback. So I think he's first ballot Hall of Famer, but yes, I think this will probably be it, and then hopefully we get a good draft and can get somebody young in.
Well, being a Bears fan, you have a lot more Super Bowls than I do. I'm still hanging on to 1985, but that's all I got. But well, hey, Brian, great show. It was a lot of fun to unpack the year and look forward to next year. So really thought it was a lot of fun. And to our listeners, thanks a lot for listening. Don't forget, rate us, review us, give us feedback. Hit that like button wherever you find us, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcast. So thanks for everybody, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.